Well, I'd like to welcome everybody this afternoon. Our next presenter, and this is actually the final presentation for the day, uh, is Gordon Smith, who's going to be speaking about the Port Hood Provisionals. And just a little bit about Gordon. He started collecting stamps when he was about 10 years old, and he discovered his mother's old stamp albums. He became an avid collector of Canadian used stamps, and he happily worked to fill his Parliament album pages and has a pleasant memory of catching a bus downtown all by himself to visit the stamp desks in the large department stores. Like many others by university, his stamp collecting activities ceased. In 1994, he moved to Botswana, and his stamp collecting interest reawakened when he began to receive mail with beautiful Canadian stamps on them. And looking for something additional to collect, he realized that nobody was tracking the postal history of meter marks in Botswana, and so he began his adventures in collecting the non-stamped mail of Botswana. Currently, he collects and exhibits meter marks, official free marks, permit mail, registration labels, and government printed envelopes from Botswana. He also collects and exhibits the postal history of Port Hood and Port Hood Island, which is in Nova Scotia, and he maintains what he calls a reasonable collection of pre-2000s Canada Use stamps just for old time's sake. So, Gordon, I'm going to stop my sharing and invite you to take over. And we will have time at the end for some questions. So we will turn the controls over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Just get my sharing going here. Okay, so I'm assuming people can see the title slide there. Is that right?
Yep, it's all good.
Okay, so just strange. Okay, so thanks very much for that introduction. And yeah, it's interesting. In that introduction, I kind of like collecting unusual things, I'll say. But I'll have to say I don't collect the Port Hood Provisionals. They're out of my price range. But I've been very interested in them. So figuring that out. Why am I interested in these? I'm the first generation of my family not born on Port Hood Island since 1783. So my family moved to Nova Scotia over 200 years ago. And like my introduction said, I collected stamps as a youngster, but then I collected again when I was in Botswana. I joined a stamp club there, and someone in Botswana, actually noting my interest in the postal history of Port Hood Island, gave me a copy of this sheet that's shown on the right-hand side here from what I believe is a Scott Master Canada album. And I'd never seen these stamps or heard about them until somebody in Botswana gave me this in about 1998. Um, so ever since then, I've been quite interested in these, and I've been just researching them and trying to figure out what's the story. So where is Port Hood? Just a little map here if you go along, but if you look on the right-hand side, you can see a map of Cape Breton. If you were to cross the Canso Causeway down here, you'd go up, and it's about a 45-minute drive up on the side there, and there's the community of Port Hood that is there, and Port Hood Island. So what happened with these stamps, and why did these provisionals get produced? And so Imperial Penny Post was established on Christmas Day, 1898. This rate was the equivalent of 2 cents in Canada, and one result of that is the famous 2 cent map stamp. But it was interesting because this change in rates created a situation where it cost 3 cents to mail a 1 ounce letter within Canada, but it only cost 2 cents to mail a letter from Canada to another colony in the British Empire. So on June 13th, 1898, Parliament amended the Post Office Act to change the domestic rate from 3 cents to 2 cents on a date to be set by the Governor General. On December 29th, 1898, an order in council announced that this change in the domestic rate to 2 cents was going to be effective January 1st, 1899, only 3 days later. So in April 1899, the Gibbon Stamp Monthly quotes an extract from a letter from the postmaster in Port Hood, and he stated that that change in the postal rate with such short notice caused him to run out of 2 cent stamps. And so that to keep his accounting straight, he cut 3 cent stamps into 1/3 piece and 2/3 pieces. about 100, he said about 100 of each of these values were created, and they were bisected uh, and placed on envelopes for delivery throughout Canada. He said he only did this for one day, and they were just, as I said, used throughout Canada. But it's interesting because there's about a total of 10 articles describing these stamps appeared in Stanley Gibbons' Monthly Journal, the American Journal of Philately, Canadian London Philatelist, and Meikle Stamp Weekly Stamp News before the end of 1899. So within a year, there was 10 articles written about these things. They kind of described the stamps, corrected information about their appearance, and indicated their creation was unauthorized by the post office. But it wasn't like they announced them starting in January, but it was only in March did the Gibbons Stamp Monthly say that Port Hood was the location where these surcharges were applied. And it's been interesting for me, like working on these. I started, as I said, being interested in them in the late 1990s. I used Simon Morin's bibliographies and managed to get 2 or 3 articles, prints from the National Archives of Canada through interlibrary loans sent to me, and kind of, other things interfered and kind of lost interest for a while. Then I looked again when I moved back to Canada in 2002. I got another couple of articles from places, had another go at it in 2007. And by that time, things were starting to show up on the internet with digitization of resources, and probably got about another 15 or 20 articles. And then had another look again in COVID, early 2020s through 2021. And so much had been digitized at that time, I actually came up with about 69 different articles that had been written about these, and had managed to collect those. So the change in how we can research things has been really dramatic, I'd say, in the last 20 years, where it went from very challenging to find things to I was able to find, all those journals I mentioned, the 10 articles from the 1899 from 1899 printed out, and I could research those. So it's been an interesting time how digitization of library materials and journals has really helped out. So, but just thinking about this a little bit more, and like the postmaster at the time in Port Hood was John Mackay. Local histories record him as an upstanding citizen. He was clerk of the county court, a municipal councillor, and he ran the Mackay House Hotel. But it's interesting if you look at W. Harrington's report from 1994. He says that it appears that the postmaster of Port Hood, acting on the advice of some stamp fiend, apparently cut up a sheet or so of stamps to make 2s and 1s, and that the postmaster almost lost his job on it. And it said that the department never got a hold of any of these mutilated stamps. In 1929, Fred Jarrett talks about Donald King, who was a prominent philatelist and an active dealer who worked for the Halifax post office at the same time. And he'd made inquiries about the creation of these provisionals. And the post office department conducted an investigation, sent an inspector to Port Hood. It said that the inspector took possession of all the used and unused copies of the provisionals that were remaining, and they were eventually destroyed. However, a few of covers were sold to Stanley Gibbons before the postal inspector arrived. And if you look, they'd say that these items were backstamped with the firm's name. And it's interesting just looking at King and thinking about that quote about Stamp Fiend and who might have encouraged the postmaster to do this. Michael Peach, in an article in the Canadian Philatelist in 2021, talks about King, and he said that when he became aware that there was going to be a shortage of the 1/2-cent and 6-cent Jubilee stamps, he wrote to the postmaster in Port Hood asking him to send all of the values of those stamps that he had on hand. And it would seem to indicate that the postmaster in Port Hood may have had some relationship with Donald King. And so could King be this stamp fiend described in Harrington's letter? So just continuing on with trying to get the story of why these were created, in the B&A record of December 1930, Jarrett gives us kind of a whimsical and I think imaginary account of the creation of these provisionals, where he said the postmaster claimed time off for illness, was actually away rabbit hunting, and that the youthful postal assistant, being philatelically inclined and having no restraining influence, got out his scissors and created these stamps to sell to Stanley Gibbons. And then a number of prominent philatelists repeat Jarrett's story over the next number of years, and that story, even into the 1980s, continues to get recounted as the postmaster was away, and it was the assistant that created these stamps, but there's no evidence anywhere that that's an accurate story. And then it's interesting, in 1930, Jarrett, in one of his articles, in contrast to a statement in his 1929 book, that it was Donald King, not just a postal inspector, who went to Port Hood. The earlier thing that he said was a postal inspector went. And he says that Donald King brought the stamps back to Halifax, where they were burned in a fireplace. In 1948, Jarrett repeats his statement that Donald King was sent to Port Hood to investigate, but he adds that King didn't take the items he brought back to Halifax when the postmaster there offered them to him before tossing them in a fire. So he says that they were burnt, but in one case he says they were burnt by Donald King in Halifax, and in the other case he says that they were burnt by the postmaster in Port Hood. So in this January 1931 issue of his journal, Jarrett says there was an official inquiry made in the House of Commons about these stamps, and that the Postmaster General stated that the stamps were not sanctioned by the government, but they had been accepted as postage. I've had a look through the Hansard for the Canadian House of Commons from 1899 to 1904, and I can't find any indication of such an inquiry. I continue to kind of poke around in government records when I get a chance to see if I just perhaps haven't searched the term correctly or whatever, but you can get the Hansard now for the Canadian Parliament, I think, right from the start of government up to current times, and you can do keyword searches and things like that. So it's quite interesting, again, how the digitization of resources can help us with our research. So trying to think about these things, and were they legitimately used or were they philatelic creations? And that's been an argument that's been ongoing for a century. As I mentioned before, there's been over 60 articles about these stamps written since 1899. There was that first issue in Stanley Gibbons' monthly journal in 1899, January 1899. No mention of Port Hood, but they do talk about these stamps that were bisected 1/3 and 2/3. And it's kind of an amazing coincidence when you think about it, because the stamps were only produced on January 5th of that year. They would have had to get the information and print the journal and get it out before the end of the month. And this is coming from a little town in Port Hood going to London, England for that publication. So it was like within a couple of weeks, um, Stanley Gibbons was aware of the creation of these stamps. And it said that the notice was sent to Stanley Gibbons via letter franked with a 2/3 portion of the stamp. And it's in this article that Evans, as I mentioned before, said that this creation of these stamps was a horrible occurrence. Looking at opinions all over the years, people say they're fakes, they're absolutely unauthorized, unworthy of recognition. Stamps and covers are bogus. That was from Jarrett. Absolutely unauthorized. I scarcely think it should be recognized. That was a person giving a talk at the Royal Philatelic Society of London in 1907. But then you look at Evans, 1899, in the Stanley Gibbons Monthly Journal. It should not be considered too serious an issue if a postmaster who runs out of 1-cent stamps bisects 2-cent stamps to keep his accounting straight. We get questions going on. How did Gibbons get the monopoly on these stamps? Richardson in 1963 should never have been placed in the catalog. Even the fact that Boggs wrote about them does not make them smell any better. And then, as I was mentioning, that sort of rapidity with which information got to Stanley Gibbons was phenomenal. And then, he says this is Georphy in the Halpex 65 show program. This seems to indicate speculation behind the scene, as was always just suspected by Mr. Jarrett. So, talking about the suspicion of philatelic influence, as definite grounds for their nullification, that they were a product of a philatelic mind. To the extreme specialists, these stamps on cover may be of interest in studying the postal history of Canada, but off cover the stamp is officially a fraudulent item. I thought this quote from 1900 in the lower right, no more deserving of collection as postage stamps than the hand stamp or pen mark on an envelope would be if no stamp or a portion of stamp had been affixed. And it's interesting as we think about us being postal historians, this fellow here is throwing all of our sort of postal history studies under the bus. You know, it's not who's interested in hand stamps. And I think we tend to be quite interested in hand stamps as we do this. Then are they collectible creations? So Stevenson in Maple Leaves says, if you get one on cover well tied, it's certainly a prize worth keeping. Boggs in 1945 entitled a high consideration equal to that of any other Canadian bisect. Stamps listed in the catalog, so it has philatelic recognition. At least collectible on cover if they were not manufactured for philatelic purposes. Oops. So, like looking at opinions on these things. So, looking at the articles that I've collected, 18 authors think they're legitimate, 21 think they're not legitimate, 11 have no opinion, and 11 of these articles are just kind of descriptions of auctions or descriptions of forgeries and not really offering an opinion on them. But the Scott catalog states that covers reported to date were backdated and never saw postal use. So that would seem to indicate that they were created after the fact. Looking at some of the names here of people. So, I was mentioning Boggs and Stevenson and Robson Lowe are all people who say that they think they're relatively legitimate, although opinions seem to change over time. Lowe certainly has said that, you have to be very careful if you're collecting these. Jarrett, Pollock, Howes, and Horsley, who would all consider major sort of philatelic authors and experts on Canadian material, would say that they think they're philatelic creations. So they weren't actually used legitimately, but somebody had them created just to reflect the shortage in stamps that had occurred, or to reflect that change in the postal rates. So I've also done a census of these, and this has been an interesting exploration as you read about these things in different articles or different places, or you're looking in auction catalogs that you have, they often provide provenance. And so it's been interesting to try to trace that provenance back and see, okay, can I find a copy of this catalog from, 1929, for example? And I'm actually surprised how many I have been able to find and how helpful different libraries have been. So the Vincent Graves Green Library there has been fantastic. The American Philatelic Research Library has been really good. Um, there's the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library, also the Philatelic Library for the Royal Philatelic Society of London, England. I've gotten material from all of them, and they've been extremely helpful, and it's interesting how often these catalogs contain photographs and things, so you can start to trace them. So I've looked at 73 different auctions, 22 images and articles, and then also 25 images from expertization certificates. So there's the Philatelic Foundation in the United States. They have many of their certificates online, and you can look at the material that they have there to see whether they've expertized something as legitimate or not. So looking at all these auctions and images and things, I've come across 27 different mint, unused or off paper stamps, 35 different stamps on piece, and 19 different covers in various formats. These numbers that I've got here include known forgeries and listings without images. And in my census, I've also noted any expertization certificates that were there. So if I'm looking at these and I've looked at the covers and looked at 15 non-forged covers, it's interesting to me that many of the covers have the name McDonald on them. So Senator McDonald was located in Prince Edward Island. His son, Reginald, worked at People's Bank of Halifax in Port Hood. And if I look at the covers here, out of these 15 covers, more than half are easily, or almost all of them are related to the People's Bank or have the name McDonald on them. So I would suspect that they seem to be created by folks related to Mr. McDonald. So it's interesting. Well, the Port Hood postmaster in his letter that I mentioned earlier said that envelopes with these stamps on them were mailed throughout the Dominion. The census of only seen covers that are to the bank in Port Hood or to Charlottetown. I haven't seen anywhere else in Canada. As I mentioned, they seem to be many related to Mr. McDonald in some way. And I think, well, the original necessity to make provisional stamps to meet a new rate could be seen as legitimate. The lack of variety in people or businesses receiving the covers would tend to point to them being philatelic creations made by or under the influence of just one person. In 1929, again, I mentioned that a few covers were sold to Stanley Gibbons before the post office inspector arrived, and that these were stamped with the firm's name on the back of the cover. And again, this is kind of interesting to me, is if they were created before the post office inspector arrived and they were sent to Stanley Gibbons, that would tend to say that there's a fairly short period in there and somebody knew what they were doing and was making a philatelic creation to send to Stanley Gibbons or to sell. But dealers and expertising committees look at the presence of a Stanley Gibbons hand stamp on the back of the cover of the stamp as conferring legitimacy on these items, saying that they are from that period. And then going through the list of auctions and things like that in the census, there's a number of pieces there, probably about a dozen or so, that have the Stanley Gibbons stamp on them. And the image on the right here, you can just see the little purple there. It's not very clear, but that's a Stanley Gibbons stamp on the tenant block of 1 cent provisionals. So these things, there's a lot of forgeries out there, and looking at them, just trying to see what's happening with those and understanding them. And it's interesting to get the thoughts of different people on these. So you look at Holmes, freaks that anybody could make. Pollock in 1937, surcharge was made from a rubber type of dater. It might be quite easily forged. Blair and Stamp Review, it is not wise to buy used copies unless they're tied on a cover, and you should always get a guarantee. Leave unused copies alone and be extremely careful in regards to covers. And I'll talk about prices a little bit later on, but it's interesting to me that the stamps actually seem to sell for more value than the covers at this time. I look at Pollock here, and the manner in which they were made makes it impossible to expertise them. So you want to make sure that you've got stamps and they've got the appropriate Port Hood cancel on them. And then this is from the Canadian Philatelist in 1963. Fake Port Hood surcharges are quite common. I've got one that's got the correct type of Port Hood NS cancel, but he says actually the cancellation is forged as well. And he says that, if he looks at the piece that he had, it's almost a perfect forgery of that, illustrated in Boggs' book from 1949. So again, some more stuff here. Robson Lowe, he has said that he thinks they're legitimate, but he said they're of poor parentage and many students have considered them to be an illegitimate use. He said expert opinions are usually valueless. We've seen more forged Port Hood provisionals with forged cancellations with certificate of genuineness than we have seen genuine provisionals. And so asking around and talking to different people, Ariel Hasid of WIP International, the Canadian Philatelic Expertising Service, has said he was, when I was talking to him, he said there's one way you can always tell. You want to make sure that the postmark has the top of it pointing to 3 o'clock, and that would indicate generally a legitimate Port Hood provisional cover or stamp or piece. So if you look at the two images that I have here, the one with the red block around it is an acknowledged forgery, and you can see how the provisional, the postmark is pointing sort of up to the right. Whereas if you look at the other one, which is considered a legitimate piece, you can see how the postmark at the top of it is pointing to 3 o'clock. So it's interesting too. I asked the question about these dates because the postmaster said, "Oh, I only created them for one day only," but he doesn't say what date was the right date. And I'm wondering if he made this statement to try to limit the reprimand he might receive for having contravened the regulations for a longer period. So did he do them for 2 days, not just one day? But looking through the literature, the first reference to a date is from Horsley in 1907. He describes the cover that he has dated January 5th, 1899. And Howes says that Horsley, who was a fellow of the Royal Philatelic Society of London, showed him this cover and said that, in Howe's opinion, doubtless the one day they were employed was January 5th. And then following these two mentions of a date, 16 authors also quote the date 1899 as the date of creation. But it's interesting, Boggs, who says that these were created on January 5th, and says that used copies must be on covers with that date, uses a piece to illustrate it, and with more recent scans that are of higher quality, his illustration actually has a date of January 4th on it. You can see that on the right side, and you can see the arrow pointing to the number 4 for the January 4th date. So it's kind of funny saying you need to have a legitimate one of these. It should be January 5th, but he illustrates it with a January 4th cover. So the first mention of a cover with a date of January 4th is Stevenson in 1951. So that's 52 years after the creation of these covers. And he says he's seen it and he has no reason to doubt its genuineness. And then in 1953, he talks about another piece he's seen with stamps bisected in the same way, but with a postmark of January 3rd, 1899, but it's from Mulgrave. And he says, oh, maybe we should just keep a very open mind to the actual first day of issue of these stamps. He says the one from the Mulgrave post office, he doesn't make any mention of surcharges on these stamps. So it could be created by the Mulgrave post office and not necessarily be a Port Hood provisional. Sorry. So Poole in 1953, he says it's January 5th, but he uses the same illustration as Boggs, but he acknowledges that that's dated January 4th. If we look in the Unitrade catalog, the editors have stated that they've seen covers dated the 4th or 5th. And Scott Catalog says that the Port Hood provisionals were prepared and used on January 5th. So even today, these are modern catalogs. We still have some dispute over the dates on them. So looking at the covers and all the ones with January 4th, and you see these sort of coding there. I have C2L7, C2R1. Those just are my own codes that I use. So a C is for cover. The piece means it's a 2-cent piece, and it's a left-hand side, because you can have a left-hand side or a right-hand side of the stamp. So left, L and R are right, and then the number at the end is just the order in which I first sort of discovered it. But it's a way for me to say, okay, I'm talking about this cover. But if we look at those, all the covers with a date of January 4th are addressed to Senator A.A. McDonald in Charlottetown, and they're the only covers that are known to be addressed outside of Port Hood. And if I look at the lettering, and there's some slightly different shaped lettering, but if I look at the covers, they all seem to be written more or less in the same hand. And then given that all the items have their postmarks facing to the right, they've received expertising certificates from different organizations, and a couple of them have Stanley Gibbon back stamps. The unusual date and same addressee would point to these items being philatelic creations at the time and not later forgeries. So I think there's some piece there to say that they were legitimate or they were created just right after the date when somebody said, oh, there's been a couple of these made locally, so let's make some extra ones here and we'll send them to Senator McDonald, or we'll collect them for him to have in his collection. This is just showing all the different handwriting. If I look at the different covers, and you can look at the things like the number 3 is the C in Charlottetown, often seems to be the same way, or the number 4, the D in Port Hood, is often shaped in the same way. Or you look at the number 6, People Bank of Halifax, same thing. So out of these, I think we're looking at 8 to 12 covers here. You could argue that most of them appear to have been written by the same hand. So did somebody just produce a whole bunch of these to, um, you know, make a little philatelic profit on the side? So the other thing that I was looking at here as well is thinking about values, and are these, they're quite valuable now. I've seen covers for $15,000. I've seen individual stamps sold for $75,000. So I was curious, are they a good investment? So looking at the values and tracking them across, what I did was I did conversions to Canadian dollars and then converted those into 2022 dollars to see did the values go up. And I did a comparison of earliest auction known for an item to the latest auction known for an item, and where I had multiple auctions for one item was just sort of tracking it there. And if you look, the column with the colors in it, the red or green, did the price go up over time or go down over time? And I was curious to see if expertization had any influence on that at all. So we can see, it's here or there, right? Like some have gone up quite considerably. So the first one there went up almost 400% in 16 years. But if I look at, the fourth one down here from 1963 to 1986, so in 23 years, it actually decreased in value by almost 80 or more than 85%. Here's an interesting one. If I look fourth from the bottom, the first sale of it was in 2009 in May. In 2000 September, it had actually increased in value by 132%. Then it basically stayed the same for 10 years. And then again, it increased in value by, well, if I go right from the start to the end, then up to 2019, it's 132%. So just, I don't think thinking about these in terms of value, if I was thinking about them as an investment, I might not necessarily be investing in Port Hood provisional covers, but that's maybe a little bit more research that would be interesting to do here, is to understand which are the ones that, is there some particular quality that's made them increase in value more. So just ending this and thinking about these, are they worthy of collection is kind of the way I like to ask it. I just curious about if they're philatelic creations or are they forgeries or what are they? Are they worthy of collection? And I think it's interesting to me because they do occupy places of distinction in the collections of well-known and well-regarded collectors like the royal family in England. The Queen of England had 2 covers from these. Dale and Liechtenstein, who are also very well-known British North America collectors, had a number of them. If we look at the prices, they tend to demand very high prices at auction and private treaty sales. Um, it's interesting. I don't think forgers necessarily make forgeries of things that they don't think they're going to make much money on. So, Frodo and other people tend to have made, forgeries of these. They are listed in major catalogs like Stanley Gibbons and Scott, Unitrade and Lowe. And I think the story of their creation and the provenance of these items also adds to their cachet and consequent value. So looking around, still get very high prices for them in the United States and Europe. But I think what it ultimately comes down to is, willing seller, willing buyer that agree on a price. And is that what makes them valuable? So with that, I'm going to call it as an end, and I'm very happy to take questions. I'll figure out how to stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you very much, Gordon. That was great. Well, it occurred to me as I was listening to this that I've been trying to get my 5-year-old granddaughter interested in stamp collecting. And when my wife and I travel, I've been sending her postcards from wherever we're traveling. And a few years ago, we did a trip out to the Maritimes and drove the Cabot Trail and spent time in Cape Breton. And as you know, nowadays Canada Post does not cancel their material when it goes through the postal system, which is really frustrating. So when I stopped to send her a postcard, I would actually go to the post office and present it to the clerk and beg them for a nice hand cancel. Well, the problem was when we got to Port Hood, and I was specifically wanting to get something canceled at Port Hood for all the reasons you just been talking about. We arrived there on a Sunday. Of course, the post office is closed. So at the top of my note on the postcard to my granddaughter, I said, I hope that the nice postmaster in Port Hood will recognize, or I forget what I said,
Yeah.
the historical importance of Port Hood, and please give me a nice hand cancel. And lo and behold, somebody read my little note, and lo and behold, she got a nice little hand cancel. So that's my personal connection to Port Hood, and I've always been fascinated by this whole story. So thanks very much. I'll stop my talking and see if anybody has any questions they want to ask. You can unmute your microphone if you like.
And I might just add to your story a little bit because my family still has property in Port Hood and I go up fairly often. And they used to have oh, I'm drawing a blank, the hockey player cancellation, Al McGuinness cancellation, and that stopped. And then I was talking to them one day. I was driving into town. And they had this beautiful round sign that was the Port Hood, the beach capital of Cape Breton. And I said, man, like that's the perfect shape for a cancellation. So I went in and talked to the postmaster to say, like, what do you have to do if you want to make a suggestion for a cancellation? And I talked to them about it a little bit. And then I went back the next year. I'd talked to the Historical Society saying maybe they wanted to advocate for a postmark like this or something. And I went in, the postmaster was, oh, I've already done that. And so they now had a new commemorative postmark of Port Hood, the Five Beaches, with this like beautiful Adirondack type chair on it and things like that. And I was thinking, well, it's interesting how maybe I'm one of those stamp fiends that have influenced the postmaster.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks. Anybody else any questions?
You mentioned a king earlier on. Can you repeat that section for me? I just sort of missed that.
Sure. So it was a fellow by the name of Donald King. He was a stamp dealer, fairly well known in Nova Scotia around like the late 1890s, early 1900s, up to 1920 or so, I think. If you look in the Canadian Philatelist from 2021, Michael Peach has written an article about Donald King and sort of the history of his stuff. And he was a bit of a wheeler dealer, it sounds like buying old Nova Scotia stamps. They found a whole bunch somewhere, and he and a partner went in and bought these things and was selling them. And it always struck me as a little funny as somebody working for the post office also being a philatelic dealer. I know there was a lot of that probably happening at the time, but it was
His
just
wife, Emily King, she was the dealer, was she not?
I'd have to double check. I think he did use his daughter's name for
Daughter
some.
or yeah, something like that. Because I felt
That's
my understanding was that he couldn't be a dealer as a postmaster, but then he used family. I thought it was his wife,
yeah,
maybe
family names.
daughter's
Yep,
name,
yep,
because I have a cover, to Emily King, and so it's really obviously a stamp dealer,
yep,
and I wondered about that.
yeah. No, I think
It-
that's right now that you're reminding me that piece of it. Yep,
It's interesting how, people can use their family well, I guess to improve their business, whatever.
yep.
The
Interesting.
reminder that there's another dubious dealer in Nova Scotia, Henry Heschler or Heckler, who was a businessman and also in the military reserve, went out to the Riel Rebellion, served there, and started off this on service um, rates. and then he later became president of the Philatelic Society, Canadian Philatelic Society, and but yeah, he was forever branded as a forger, and that, and so it kind of sounds the same thing as what you're going through with your Port Hood scenario. You know, is it genuine? Is it not? And opinions vary over all the years. But thanks for sharing that and reminding me, because I'd forgotten all about those Port Hood Provisionals. Just yeah,
Yeah, so if you're interested in learning a lot more, seeing a lot of the research in this in detail, the Postal History Society of Canada has published a monograph. So if you go to their site, um, there's believe it or not, a 50-page book that I've written about these things. So probably about 30 pages that just explained a lot of the information I went through there. And then there's probably about a dozen pages that's an annotated bibliography of every article that I've found on them.
yeah, okay. Well, I'm a member, so I'll go check that out again.
Yeah, and if you can't find it, you can get my email address and reach out to me, and I can make sure you get an address there. But it's just, it was an interesting obsession that kind of just kept rolling and turned into this, like this piece that I've written about it. And I guess that's like, these are things I'll probably never own one of these, but it's been a very interesting journey to explore them. And that's what I think makes postal history interesting in a way as well, is that it's like
Yeah.
that, the research of this and the digging, and it's, like we all get a thrill when we're searching through the stamp box at a stamp show and we find a cover we love. For me, some of that thrill has been like, I've been looking for this article from 1902 for like 12 years, and I've got it, right? Like, and now I can read that. And it's been very interesting to go back to the primary source. And it was interesting for me, for example, like, what's this story about this guy going out hunting, and his thing, and like trying to find out when that story started, and and then reading the actual article that it came from 1930, and like, this is pretty whimsical, like just the way it's written. So although it's become like the story of the creation of these things, I'm actually not convinced that it's the true story. I think it was just a lovely story that Fred Jarrett made up to kind of put in his journal.
Amazing.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Did anybody have any final questions before we'll shut things
I'm
down?
impressed with the research. Just a great
Yes.
job.
Yeah, it was excellent.
Thank you for sharing.
Really, it's
Thanks.
amazing, amazing research you've done there. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.